Okay, hopefully by now, folks who are catching this on the YouTube page or on Facebook or wherever it is, you guys can hear it and hear my voice and see it. I am here with Jose Humphreys, who just all of a sudden got camera shy. He just left us now. Oh, he's back. Okay, cool. As you guys know, the Q2 podcast is sponsored by Panvisio, and we really are super passionate about social change, and especially using technology as a way to facilitate social change and amplify social change efforts and groups. And it's a pleasure to have Jose Humphreys back for a second time, number 2.
That's right.
Come back. Thanks for coming, Jose.
Glad to be here.
So, if you guys don't know, Jose Humphreys is a consultant. He's a facilitator. He has a new consulting company, and we're just chatting before we went live about that things are going well. And I wanted to start off with just kind of giving our viewers and listeners an update. Since we last spoke, you were just a pastor, quote unquote, just a pastor, but now you've kind of like really owned your different gifts and really kind of moved that in the front stage almost. How's that been, and how's that going, and how can people learn more about what you do?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's not just the pastor, but
exactly right.
Pastoring in and of itself has so many dimensions to it. But I think, aside from living in New York City and just requiring multiple hustles, as we say, to make ends meet, it's really good that I've been able to take on this consulting stuff, because before I was a pastor, I was actually a facilitator and consultant, and a lot of those gifts actually converge, which is great. I know some people that are bivocational and they're not able to kind of connect those two things, but I've been really blessed and fortunate that the work that I do for my consulting, whether it's staff development, training, nonprofit executives and things like that, a lot of those gifts mix actually converge. So they don't necessarily feel like side hustles, but part of a seamless expression of what I do for a living. I'm the tool, I'm the instrument, and gratefully I get to share these gifts.
Yeah, and I'm pumped for you, and I'm pumped for anyone who's stepping in this space, because I'm all for, number one, the side hustle. It's a great way to really hone in on your craft, your strengths, your God-given strengths, to really, help be a blessing to others through that, and work on those things. But also, the issues that we're addressing. I know you're doing a lot of great stuff with prison, almost like a prison ministry, but you're taking it to the next level with Exodus and Community Connections for Youth and what you do there. Now is such a time, man. This is just an amazing time where people are starting to wake up like, hey, we do have to shift gears a little bit and be a little more formal, be a little more intentional, and dare I say, be a little more structured. As that sometimes that's a ugly word or a nasty word in our circles. Can you just kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think what, in essence, you're saying, and what I was thinking when you were describing that, is we're looking at a new way of being the church, ecclesiology, if you will, where the pastor is structuring his time in a very intentional way. And it's new and it's not new, because I know a lot of bivocational pastors from when I grew up in the Spanish Assemblies of God who are doing this anyway. And in many ways, it's a viable incarnational model, being a chaplain in your community. For example, Exodus Transitional Community, an organization that works with people who are coming back home from prison, is about 5 or 6 blocks away from where I live. So I get to be, in many ways, an official chaplain there. I get to do some of the staff development. And I think, above all things, it gives our church a presence and a form of relation. So it allows the reach of the church to become something generative. And it doesn't just happen on a Sunday, right, in a service, but we're there during the week providing presence, providing prayer, and providing a sense of attention to the things that are easily ignored when you get caught up with the church machine itself.
Yeah, I agree. And now, what's great about that is like it's not like you're doing one at the expense of the other. You know, prayer and spiritual formation is still part of that. I'm sure you bump into conversations where you just want to start praying for the dude right then and there, maybe, or something. That may or may not happen, but I know it's like one identity is not at the expense of the other. And I think that's what people are so afraid of. They're afraid of that. They have to take off one to put on the other. And for people who are in ministry, but they have a passion for social justice, I think that's not your flesh. That's not. I think you might be listening into maybe a calling of some sorts, and you have to pursue that. And you can have those dual things.
Right.
Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's a seamless expression of your faith, and where I think many of us have inherited an overly pietistic, individualized kind of gospel. It's me and God, then everything else. The way that I look at the gospel, the way that many people before me have looked at the gospel is that this story, this narrative, is not only lived out personally, but it also has public consequence.
Yes.
The way that we locate ourselves is not within just the church or within our spiritual closet, so to speak. We're part of a larger ecology, if you will, an ecosystem, being our neighborhood, being our community, being our city. And we are conversant with those things with and through our faith. So inherently, our faith is conversant with all of the different things that we just mentioned right now. It's conversant with nonprofit organizations, how we shop locally and steward our dollars, how we neighbor. Are we
Bingo.
neighboring with those who are within close proximity to us? And I could go on about that, but it really is a lens and a way that we operationalize. Yeah, that's right. That you kind of tongue-tied there. We allow that to be the seamless expression of what our faith is to many different areas.
Yeah, when you said the neighbor too, you just said when they ask them, but who's my neighbor, when they're getting tripped up with the Samaritan story. It's all around us. So that kind of brings us to the segue to one of the things that we talked about a while back. I saw this, YouTube and their algorithms are a blessing and a curse. Sometimes you stumble upon some gems, some things, you watch some things that make your jaw drop, like, how can this person even say this or believe this? And this is one where you're the first person I thought of. Instantaneously, I messaged you and said, yeah, we got to speak on this, because it is so, my personal feeling, maybe viewers and listeners maybe feel otherwise, but this was so detached and out of sync with I think what is the Christian identity of naming the gospel and the heart of the gospel, and the dismissiveness and the lightness of it, to really try to explain it away. I think there's going to be a segue that I'm going to just jump right in, because it's starting to get me going anyways. So this is John Macarthur. I'm going to play a clip for everyone who hasn't watched this video before. Fingers crossed. I hope you guys can hear it. But there's John Macarthur, who is one of the most prominent scholarly pastors. You got some pastors who are like really great with the preaching and the style of preaching. Then you got those who are scholarly, and he's one of the latter categories. And a bunch of books. And both our parents our fathers are big fans of him. So hopefully we don't get in trouble for this. But John Macarthur is one of the most prominent pastors, and this is his take on the Black Lives Matter movement and the church's response to the uprising and the issues we're facing as a country when it comes to racial justice and reconciliation and the role of the church. I'm going to play it here, and we'll come up and get Jose's thoughts on it. Okay, catch you. Here it is.
Had an issue with race since the beginning, and we've seen a continued increase in racial issues from Ferguson to the Black Lives Matter movement. How does the church address it? Because there are some who are true believers that feel that the church isn't necessarily addressing those issues. But as we know, it's all about sin and the gospel at the very heart of it. But how does a pastor address this if their church isn't predominantly African American, or doesn't want to become a social justice church?
First of all, I think you have to have this absolute confidence. Jesus said, I will build my church. He has already predetermined before the foundation of the world the racial mix of his church. Okay? He knows how many Latinos, how many Caucasians, how many African Americans, how many Chinese, how many Japanese. Their names have been all written in the Lamb's Book of Life. So all I want to do is preach the Word of God, the gospel, with the same love that God has already determined to shed on every tribe and tongue and people and nation on the planet. So there's a sense in which it is a non-issue. It doesn't even exist as an issue. I can't fix racial injustices. I can't fix people who feel like they're disenfranchised. I can't fix the history of the world. I can't rewrite the American history. I can't take anger out of people who feel like they're being flooded with Muslim Arabs who are changing their culture. I can't fix that. My responsibility is to realize that in Christ there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, bond nor free. We're all one in Christ, and that the Lord has chosen his church, and that my responsibility is to preach the gospel, throw my arms open to receive the ones the Lord has chosen, and embrace that with complete and full joy. The object of life is no longer to fix past injustices. The object of life now is to proclaim Christ to whomever. And I just will not give that up for another agenda. I'm not going to say, now you're a believer, I'm going to send you back into a pre-salvation world and ask you if you can fix that. It just can't be done. I'd rather say, you've come to Christ, whatever your culture you've come from, you are now a missionary for the gospel. Go to those people in your sphere of influence and take Christ to them. And once they come to Christ, all other issues, the world is full of issues, obviously, but all other issues fall away. They disappear, and the gospel takes prominence. All who are in Christ, chosen by the Lord, brothers and sisters in Christ, without regard to any kind of ethnicity, that's the body of Christ, and that ought to be celebrated by the church. Look, I'm not talking as a white guy just on the outside.
So I'm going to pause it right there, because after that he spends about a minute and a half talking about his experience with black church leaders in the South, and then his work in those circles. And he almost gives it almost like a claim for credibility and like a street cred of sorts in that piece. But I'll pause it right there. We may or may not get to the rest. It's really kind of like the same stuff. But Jose, I mean, this is one of the most popular, prolific pastors, writers in our time. And a lot of people get a lot of cues from this guy. Where do we even begin in teasing away how a Christian believer should be approaching this kind of thing?
Wow, where do we start with that?
I know, right? Like,
we can start so many different places. I'll start.
Or initial impressions, wherever we want to take it.
And I say this with all due respect to John Macarthur. My dad, as you had mentioned earlier, has many of his books. Loves
Same here.
Sermons, and as a Reformed teacher, he's pretty eloquent and has a tremendous knowledge base. Now, here is where I diverge. I think he has a different understanding of what the gospel is. And I think when we think about this gospel message and how it speaks to something like race, we have to realize that race is a sin, and we have to name it for what it is. And I think that what often happens—
Racism, you mean?
Race and racism, I should say. That's right. Racism is a sin. Oh. And oftentimes when we talk about racism and we talk about sin, we often leave it in these kind of like general categories. And for example, what you heard Macarthur say allowed him to kind of be staring from the outside in on this whole matter of race, but he's never recognizing his own whiteness or his own privilege within the midst of this stuff. And part of what the gospel story is about is recognizing how we are also complicit in, namely sin, in an Isaiah kind of moment where we say, hey, woe unto me, for I am an unclean person, unclean man among a people of unclean lips and hands as well. I see it enough of is just this idea that we are part of the problem, that our society is part of the problem, and that until we begin to name this sin of racism, not race, and also begin to name whiteness. In other words, the complicitness of whiteness in these situations that we face. We're going to continue to talk about race in very individualized terms. Well, I'm not a racist, or I was a part of a movement, and as he had mentioned earlier, I got to talk with my friend John Perkins, but in no way does that exclude someone their larger participation in a system that needs to be dismantled.
Yeah, so you're saying, like he says himself, like I've done funeral ceremonies in the high schools in the South after Martin Luther King Jr. got shot, because again he was working deeply in the faith community around that time. He said something to the fact of that when Martin Luther King Jr. Was assassinated, he was on the scene within hours, and he actually went in the hotel room and saw the angle that the person used to even take the shot. So he's almost like he's making this appeal of, I get it. I was there. I was with those people, and they were with me, and I was the only white person there many times. And while I can see how he uses that as a tool or a mechanism almost of saying, I get it, but you're saying that doesn't fly regardless.
No, because what we see here is an over-identification with a specific people group, in this case, our African-American brothers and sisters. So it would be much like me saying, well, I'm listening to a woman talk about how she was passed up for promotion because she's a woman, and then I start mansplaining, So saying that I can truly understand, and I know what that totally means. And when I recognize, hey, as a man, I'm privileged, and perhaps this hasn't happened to me in the same manner that it happened to her. So rather than me trying to over-identify with her, what I can do is empathize, which is a different story, and take on the posture of listener. And when you take on the posture of listener, it really opens up the venue for you to not only be transformed by what you're hearing, but also not try to explain away someone's experiences based on your own experiences, which, to be honest, are not as relevant as the suffering on the ground. And I think that that's what we often miss in those elements. People are consistently explaining things from their own perspective, be it through theology, be it through using statistics, using data. Meanwhile, we're glossing over the conversation, which really is about a collective history and trauma for which there has been no confession for or reconciliation about. If you look at what happened in South Africa post-apartheid, Desmond Tutu and a Truth and Reconciliation Committee had gotten together, and at least the perpetrators and people involved and victims had an opportunity to talk about things, to acknowledge things. And I think that he has never had that opportunity, or has taken a moment to realize that and pause. What we have is, in a nutshell, what you heard today and what you saw today, people speaking over the issues without having a kind of a pathos, a connection to the heart and the trauma of the issue, which is what I think the gospel is really about. A God who came down and walked in the grassroots and took on pain and took on suffering in the name of absolute love.
Yeah, and the thing with that was so interesting about, and I agree that when it comes to the gospel, there's like a one-dimensional lens used in this context where he's kind of just explaining away. And it's important to like point out, like, you know, Jesus was working with people from different classes, different, even from a career standpoint, from prostitutes to tax collectors. He was taking on the status quo. He was really, you know, and he was actually showing anger against the quote unquote establishment at that time. So there is this like Jesus. If you look at what's preached about, and I've listened to a lot of John Macarthur growing up because I was like, you know, my dad grew up in that, and I did too. And you wouldn't get that richness of the different dimensions of the implications of the gospel. That I found that I find that often when you preach or when people like you or Lisa Sharon Harper mentioned that the richness of the gospel is more than just a one-dimensional thing. He also says, I don't even this is kind of bring from a marketing perspective. I want to kind of make some highlights too for people who are listening. If you're listening this only, you can't see the video. The music is a nice soft piano music in the background, so you know it's serious, Jose. It's ironically a black and white lens. All right, it's black and white, so it's really indie. We got an indie feel. It's raw now. We're getting raw. The piano to be in the background and the black and white lens. And to top it off, what do we have, Jose? We have a black interviewer.
That's right.
Boom. To really put the icing on the cake. All right, next up here is he says it's a non-issue. So it's one thing to say it's all about the gospel and it's all about the church and the Word of God. Okay, I can see how someone from that standpoint could entertain that, although I don't agree with it. But to say it's a non-issue, that it doesn't exist, this is where I think he really falls really hard on this whole topic and issue.
Well, and that's what leads to the question of where is your social location? Mm-hmm. What James Cone, professor of systematic theology at Union Theological Seminary, I think he recently retired, but also the father of the Black Liberation Movement, would often ask the question, when you speak, from what platform are you speaking? And knowing our social location is so important because it'll determine the level of empathy and also impact we will have at any given moment. Statements like it's a non-issue really speaks to someone not being aware of their privilege. And it also speaks to someone who believes somehow that their lens for seeing the world is a normative one, and everything else is perspectival. In other words, there's the normal way of looking at the gospel, mm-hmm. the normal opinion, and then everybody else is just a perspectival kind of. There's a
deviant of the norm.
Yeah, that's right. That could just simply be wrapped around this one opinion, and it really just speaks to the vehicle and the mechanism of whiteness, that there is a privilege to be able to not only speak to certain things very eloquently, like he does every Sunday morning, this privilege so as to think that you're an authority on somehow every issue that's out there. So I'll give you an example of that. When I speak to someone about contracts, if I'm signing a contract as a consultant, I will typically speak to a lawyer who's able to kind of break down some of the language and help me to interpret some of the data, some of the pitfalls, some of the caveats. I think what happens with critical race theory, the matter of racism, and not even just the heady stuff, the experiential stuff, people try to explain that stuff away without actually having a substantial knowledge base vis-a-vis by experience and also through theoretical underpinnings about how race impacts the lives of billions of people all over this earth every day. and both on a local level and also a global level, on a policy level, and also on a day-to-day where I shop kind of level.
Yeah.
It's not until people begin to develop that lens, and if, I got to say this as well, you know, and I almost hesitate to say it, but it has to be said. We need to develop a cultural humility that says that I'm not an authority on every situation here.
Preach.
And certain things don't have a simple explanation. I need to take on the posture of listening. One theologian talks about pedagogical imperialism, how we come consistently into situations, particularly in the West, as wanting to teach people in inner city neighborhoods and poor villages, wherever it may be, about our quote unquote normative ways, where really the posture of Christ was that of also listener, not doing to, but being with people, lifting people up out of their stories without causing violence to who they were and what their experiences brought about in the moment. And that's where I saw the real violence, where he tried to, in many ways, explain away hundreds of years, thousands of years, in many cases, of oppression, hundreds of years of oppression, by saying that it's a non-issue. And it's his luxury, it is his privilege to be able to make a statement like that.
Yeah, and he even goes so far to say, I can't fix that. So on one hand, he's denying it exists. It doesn't exist. It's a non-issue. It doesn't exist. Or even maybe let's be generous, and maybe he's like saying it's so the spiritual realm is so important that it's practically not an issue. And he says, I can't fix that. Going back to your earlier statement that, you know, racism is a sin. It's a violent act. It's against your neighbor, and it's a sin. Lo and behold, the whole spiritual journey is to free ourselves from this human nature that is so prone to sin, to almost deactivate the sin mechanisms in our hearts and minds and souls, which are naturally evil, and to have this spiritual intervention to say, hey, we're free of these things. But on one hand, he talks about sin from alcohol, drugs, but racism, we can't fix that. We can't touch that. That's crazy to me.
It was a very pietistic, individualized look at sin, where even the Apostle Paul recognized the more dimensional perspective of that sin happens on this very personal level, but it also happens through powers, principalities, spiritual rulers in high places. He wasn't just referring to, the phantom zone out there. He was also referring to government entities, the Caesars of his day, who perpetuated a certain way of looking at the world that would consistently speak to narcissism, the self. I am Caesar is Lord, and also look to conquer that which was also weaker and lesser, right? You know, you're looking at an imperialistic kind of posture, and I think in many ways, when our country and when our country's representatives, be it government, be it institutions, and even be it clergy at times, we can be very Constantinian in that way, meaning that we take on the posture of the state. And when we take on the posture of the state, when we take on the mentality in many ways of imperialism, we find ourselves being able to explain away the narratives and the stories of suffering from the grassroots, from people on the ground. I think in many ways that's why the Bible really inspires me, because it is largely a story of the nomadic tribe of people who were forgotten, who were often marginalized under the thumb of empire, and they're telling their story. They're, as Paulo Freire says, they're naming the world. And it's not just Pharaoh naming the world, it's not Caesar naming the world, it's not just coming from that larger perspective, or it's not, in our case, evangelicalism naming the world of race and society as we see it, but really it's the experiences of the people of black and brown bodies, whether those bodies speak as they lie on the ground, and the ground the ground is full of their blood, which is, screams out into heaven, or whether it's those who are incarcerated in our prisons at a rate of what, we're 25% of the world's prison population. So when we look at it in that way, all these voices are confined. I would have been more interested in hearing, and I still am more interested in hearing about race and racism from, number one, the people that are affected by it the most, and then two, if you're going to be a white ally, a brother or sister, that you also be aware of your own privilege going into that. That to me is paramount for having any significant conversation on race and racism in the church. And I'm a lot more hopeful than he is, by the way. I believe that we can dismantle those things, and I've seen reconciliation happen. But oftentimes it's not without some blood being spilled, in a sense, that in a metaphorical way, and historically in an actual way, and without entering into the mess of life and society, which to me is what the gospel is. It's that incarnation. It's Jesus becoming flesh and taking on the messiness of the world and being a part of the messiness of the world. And showing true love can be transformative from the inside out. Not saying that this is a non-issue and not sitting perched high up above from the actual issue as well, or from a pulpit in someone else's case, in John Macarthur's case.
Yeah, and given his platform, when he says something like that, oh my goodness, the people around him, his platform, the stages he's on, people gravitate to, they latch on to that. That's their get out of jail free card to even think about these things and pursue them in an intentional way as a body of believers, or even as an individual. I'm not going to play the rest of the video because it's pretty much some of the same things else. But anything else that kind of came that really kind of didn't sit well with you, that you think like, wow, churches who listen to this should also consider X, Y, and Z. Anything else that came to mind that you recall from the rest of the video, or anything else for that matter?
Yeah, there are three things, and I want to get a little bit more granular because I think I was speaking in some generalities before, just as a response to the video itself. But whenever we talk, number one, whenever we talk about Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter is actually an indictment. And it's an indictment on our country, it's an indictment on our society, and it's a movement that's actually needed because we have black and brown folks saying that our dignity, and I'll include myself in that, our dignity and the image of God within us, and also as seen through our embodied bodily existence, is not being honored by a certain segment of society, be it through community policing, be it through how certain decisions are made in the halls of government, and see black and brown bodies in general, often see black and brown bodies in general. So Black Lives Matter is there in many ways as a prophetic voice to seek the path of human affirmation and dignity. And I would even go as far as to say, using my own spiritual language and my own faith tradition, that we honor the image of God in all children, no matter what color, race, or creed, or even orientation. So here's a part where I think like it's important to, for me, I get in the crossfire of language, meaning, in the context of culture, also of I learned early on in my
I mean, I grew up in the church, and one of the things that comes up when you have someone who grows up in the church, there's sometimes some leadership development opportunities. And one of the things that I learned was you got to reach people where they are, right? Jesus didn't stay close to the synagogues. Paul went out. And so that was a metaphor for us to say, hey, you got to go out and meet people where they are. Given that John MacArthur has his experience, and not even John MacArthur, but anyone else in his position, like mainstream clergy, white clergy, when they hear Black Lives Matter, what do you think they hear that caused them to kind of have a visceral reaction where they want to shut it down and not really talk about it? On one hand, it's like, yeah, there's a over spiritualized card they want to play, and boom, they don't have to deal with it. The other card is, well, actually, they're against America. They're against, God's systems and ways. Give Caesar what is Caesar's, right? We got to honor the system, and they counter that, so that's a sin. What is it that you think they hear from the Black Lives Matter? Because you explain Black Lives Matter, but when they hear Black Lives Matter, they don't get what you just said. How can we help people get to the point of where they hear Black Lives Matter and get to the understanding of the explanation that you just gave? Because when I see articles and CNN and all those different news agencies, when number one, they don't have enough time to even slice and dice the concepts, and so that for that matter. But how should we approach that? Because there is a gap between where they are and their understanding of all these issues, and how we explain these.
That's a deep question, and we could have many more conversations about this, but I'll bring in one specific thing that I would think would concern you in our conversation and in the larger conversation per se. I think that many people don't understand the nature of the conversation itself, mm-hmm. and that has a lot to do with implicit bias. Washington Post, I think back in May of this year, had an article about how people see Black men as larger and more threatening than, let's say, white
even
people.
Heavier weight too. Like they assign more weight to the body, even, like that says something too.
That's right. So many people have given into the mythology of the threatening Black male, which has been a mythology that we can trace back to the days of slavery and even Jim Crow. Our wives are threatened, our children are threatened, our societies are threatened, they're lazy, etc. These are all of the negative messages that have come about with this myth. And when people don't understand that on both conscious and unconscious means, people have been shaped by these messages. The most conscious methods I see are, of course, media, how we talk about black people, how we talk about brown people, or even the stories that let's say you and I as Latinos received maybe at the kitchen table. There's a lot of colorism even within our own people group about race, concerning what is true, good, and beautiful, right? As someone would say, fine hair versus thicker and textured hair, thin nose versus and more European features, blue eyes versus let's say flatter nose or larger lips, and these are all messages that we've internalized in so many different ways. So both on what I mentioned before, the more systemic social level, and the mythology of Blackness that undergirds that, and the things that we've internalized about ourselves, our communities. So it's not only Black and brown and yellow that have internalized these messages. Of course, we know white folks have as well. So getting back to the whole thing about implicit bias. So when people hear about Black Lives Matter, I think that stimulus, the Black Lives Matter acts as a stimulus, and that stimulus is connected to a whole lot of history, narrative,
associations,
culture, and the associations that people, I think, are not aware of. And it's not until people do a lot of the hard work of self-assessment, repentance, and friendship, getting into friendship with people and really listening to their stories and how these stories could actually change perspectives. Until we do that, people will continue to have a visceral reaction to Black Lives Matter. It's really preposterous. I heard someone say, hey, you know, if there's a fundraiser for breast cancer, no one's going in there, marching in there and saying, hey, you know, lymphoma matters too, you know, blood cancers matter too. You know, that kind of, it's like, no, actually, yeah, we understand it all matters, but we also realize that not all lives matter equally within our society. And we want to get from these pietistic statements, the idealistic statements that, yes, all lives should matter. I agree. I think everyone agrees on that. But the truth is that all lives do not matter in the eyes of this society.
Yeah, based on the numbers and statistics of various, however way you slice it, especially criminal justice system.
That's right. Even going back to our Constitution. So that was one thing, Black Lives Matter. The other piece that I observed as well was how he talked about the gospel, and he ended with this, and it was grave concern to me.
Yeah, I want to try to play that part.
Okay. Yeah.
Just for people to listen in, because I think it's. I mean, you've talked about the gospel. It's a freaking central basis for how we interpret the intentions and impact of Jesus' life, his words, the New Testament, all that stuff. So that's pretty huge. You said it's towards the end.
Yeah, he says something to the effect that the gospel goes from we go from social issues to spiritual issues.
Yes.
And this false kind of dichotomy between the social gospel and also the quote unquote spiritual gospel.
Yeah, I'll try to find that real quick.
Kind of chuckles when he says, "Oh, my friend John Macarthur is going around holding memorial services for Martin Luther King." Look, I've been on that side of it, and I see that, but I also see the power of the gospel, and when the gospel changes your life, you go from social issues to spiritual issues.
Boom. Yikes. So the premise there is, as the gospel becomes a central place in your life, we go from social issues to spiritual issues. My heart is literally cringing, Jose. It's literally cringing.
It really speaks to what you had mentioned earlier, that spiritual formation and discipleship is about language. And if we're discipling, in his case, thousands of people through our sermons, via our church venue, via podcasts, books, etc., and we're creating these false dichotomies, these separations between a personal gospel and a social gospel, then the natural byproduct of that is to manufacture, and I use that in quotes, disciples who only care about personal issues and personal sin and what happens to them and their relationship with Christ and whatnot, at the expense of what's happening in the world. And the gospel, as I understand it, has no false separation in that way.
There you go.
The gospel is the story of God's shalom and harmony and flourishing, not only for the individual who gets saved, but also in reconciliation of a fallen world, systems that no longer serve humanity as image bearers, the environment, not to mention, how we treat our natural resources, how we are stewarding the very things that God has given us to take care of, and also to exercise authority, not in a coercive way, but in a collaborative way as human beings. Keeping in mind God's alternative future for the world, a world of harmony, flourishing, beauty and truth, where people are reconciled to God and also to one another. So when you create these false dichotomies, it's very difficult for people then to respond to the news, to social issues, to anything that they witness outside of personal piety, without sounding like a CNN or a Fox 5 soundbite. Yeah. Because that's all the language that they know for social engagement. Their gospel isn't robust enough, or hasn't been, and I'm going to use it as a verb, languaged in such a way so as to give them the tools to participate in civic discussion.
This is great. This is great stuff. I'm getting fired up. Can you hang for another 10 minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. This is super critical. So
I feel like the Chevy just warmed up right now.
Oh yeah. Now we're cooking with gas. No, that's I'm such a nerd. Good thing this is my show and I can be a nerd, and that's all right.
And I'm dating myself, talk about carbureted engines.
Yeah, right.
Or nowhere,
like Chevys, they still make those. The thing here is, you said they're not languaged enough. I freaking love that. They're not languaged enough in this venue. So here's I have a problem, or I have an issue. Maybe you can help me out. Here's the thing. On one hand, it's amazing to me that in 2017, what we know about the gospel, what we know about the scholarly work and the spiritual interpretations and the essays and the amazing things that we have, the base of knowledge that we have, the seminaries that we have on the left and the right, so that are left leaning and right leaning, the technology that we have to Google and search and see facts about the criminal justice system and how messed up that is. I mean, I've just got them reading an amazing book that's really so powerful. Is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. Like, with access to info everywhere, it's hard to be tolerant of people who are not with it.
That's right.
On the other hand, this is where maybe the part of me you can help me out with, my spiritual side, the one that tries to be a vessel for transformation and reconciliation, says, all right, let's say for John Macarthur, he grew up, most likely, I have to look at his history, I don't want to make assumptions, but a privileged place. His education was tainted because the education that we know of is not taught in our textbooks in school. There is that division between the social and the spiritual. So he's not getting the information growing up and forming his theology and his ministry and all that stuff. The news media doesn't do any of these things justice. Oftentimes they pick the extremes on both sides and have them battle it out for ratings. And then social media, thanks to our freaking algorithms, we just click into our own social media bubble. So all the things that Facebook and YouTube know that we like just pumps us full of more confirmation bias information in culture, news, society. How the hell are we going to really expect anyone, no matter what color they are, to understand these things if they don't have the frame of reference or language to even say, oh, that's true north. Now I know how to orient myself around these issues. Are we asking too much for if we're talking about a major people group, are we asking too much for white people to really get this so fast?
Wow, that's a big question, and it might even sound and feel insurmountable if we just look at it through a humanistic lens, right? Which is why we have the resources of our faith, and we need that.
There you go.
And that hope and that love to elevate the discussion beyond the fray and also our overwhelming reality. We're always, as Christians, as spiritual people, looking toward the alternative reality, to go from what is to what ought to be, and also to live in that tension.
Yes.
And the way that, and live in that tension. And the way that I look at it is, so as not to get overwhelmed, because I am a big picture kind of person. I begin to think about, what does this just look like on a localized level for the local church pastor? Because the ideologies that people are espousing happen somewhere in a very particular place, whether it was a public school, whether it was at their church, and now in our modern age, right? And then as it happens through social media and blogs, etc. So all of these mediums, whether they were on this World Wide Web level or on a very localized level, which I want to focus on, contributed to the formation of the many voices that we often hear that separate the gospel from social, from political to personal, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a false dichotomy, and in many ways not a full gospel and an incomplete gospel. So when I think about discipleship and spiritual formation, that's where some of my hope lies. That if on a local level we're able to teach people to unlearn some of the flimsiness, if you will, right?
Yeah.
Of the gospels that they were previously given, or in some cases, they were kind of like starter gospels, right? I encountered God at this mountain, but somehow, some way, it stays there, and it has no consequence in later years, right? When it comes to how I vote, when it comes to how I treat my children, how I make decisions about my career. How does your faith and how does your gospel actually speak to those kinds of things? When you have a full gospel, all of that is informed in many ways by this good news and this story and how it's impacted your life.
Oh, I think we lost Jose. Let's try to get him back. 1 second, folks. One second, folks. And so while we wait to try to get Jose back, I think to kind of expound on what he was saying, it sounds like he was saying, like, locally, it's going to be something of a spiritual practice where your local interactions are your spiritual practice. You have to live this out in your local areas. Yeah, I think that's what it is. Yeah, local areas. Now, the thing that for me, and I'll probably, hopefully we'll get Jose back on in a second. The thing that gets me kind of going is the fact that, one, what does that look like at a local level? Sparking up conversations at the cafe, at the bodega, at the Starbucks, and the empathy that's required, I feel like, is almost, given that this is a spiritual context, we have a faith-based guest on the show, it almost requires a supernatural patience, because we see on the left there's intolerance now to even engage in discussion, even engage where people are talking and willing to listen and meet people, like how I started off with this thing, meet people where they are. So that's a big one. I'm gonna try one more time to get Jose on. And see if it works. see if I can get him on the phone. So sorry about that, folks. We're just trying to see what's
Hey,
going
man,
on.
lost you.
Hey, you're still live. I think I just piped you in through the phone. So can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I did. Am I live on the computer or am I live on the phone?
Live on the computer too. I'm calling you through my computer.
Okay, so you want me to keep talking?
Yeah. So you're mentioning how locally, there's opportunities for that. And then while I was trying to get you back, while we're waiting, I was kind of riffing off that point because what does that look like in the city? Looking from talking about it in the Starbucks to the bodegas and that stuff like that. That might require some level of patience, supernatural patience, that we're not seeing so much on the left anymore. There's a militant tone now. It's getting physical now, and it's getting kind of ugly. I want to see if you can expound on that for a little bit.
Sure. Well,
or pick up right where you left off from the when we lost you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. When I just been really, as I mentioned before, thinking about this on a local level, I think is the most important matter. Because if not, we'll get overwhelmed, or we'll create discipleship approaches that are kind of like cookie cutter, that don't speak specifically to our context.
Yeah.
So if we're really getting beyond discipleship as a deposit of information that comes from the pastor or the preacher, and expecting some sort of change, or maybe some sort of quiet time, as we evangelicals like to coin it.
Yeah.
And we think that will make us somehow more socially engaged, more empathic, then we're limiting ourselves and the power of the gospel to transform our lives. So when I think about discipleship, what I've been thinking about is how do we combine the elements of the gospel story with people's personal narratives. Mm-hmm. And your personal narrative, starting with who are you, right? I am a child created in the image of God. Who am I in the world? How does the world see me? Because by basis of that interaction, we begin to ask questions about not only our personal location, but also, guess what, our social location.
Yeah.
So that is going to influence my theology, the way that I think about God, my experience in society in terms of my skin color and what the world might think about me in light of what God thinks about me. And how am I to consistently spread this message of love, right, through my daily acts of resistance. Acts of resistance meaning love for myself, love for people who are on the margins and down and out. How I decide to, let's say...
Love for Richard Spencer?
Say that again?
Love for Richard Spencer? You know who that is?
Wait, can you refresh my recollection?
Yeah, so Richard Spencer is the person. He didn't invent the phrase alt-right, but he really popularized it.
That's right. I just drew a blank on that.
Yeah, he does. He's keeping track of these guys, right? They're popping up. Does he fall in that category, Pastor Jose?
Well, when we think of... So within the context of discipleship, right?
In terms of love.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's the most difficult thing.
Bingo.
It's hard enough to love our neighbors and love people around us, right? Mm-hmm. Coworkers, and I'm saying this as believing I'm probably the most lovable person around, and my wife has no issues with me. All right. But when Christ says love your enemy, I think he was serious. I don't think he was being allegorical, metaphorical, or anything like that. I think the kernel behind Jesus' words, I believe, really go back to the Old Testament scriptures, that when God created us, God created us in His image, in God's image. And so when we're speaking of Richard Spencer, when we're speaking of, even the president in our case, we are interacting with them not first as political opponents, but this is where divine memory comes into play.
Wow.
We are first interacting with them with the truth that they are both image bearers. And that changes the game. It really does, because it doesn't give Christians the luxury of dehumanizing people or reducing them to a political soundbite or a statistic or a label. But now we're interacting with them on different terms, on Christ terms. So that is not a natural way of responding to the world. That's why we call it spiritual formation. That is not our default.
Yeah, exactly right.
Part of spiritual formation is so that when we respond and live in the world, how we make decisions in the world, to love, to treat with kindness, to make the world more whole, is to realize that our natural inclinations are not always geared in that direction. This is why we need discipleship. My natural inclination, for example, even let's take it just into an economic scale, is to my natural inclination is to want to go for the cool and sexier product, or the new restaurant, right? That's been in many ways a product of gentrification here. And I love cafes. My wife and I love enjoying food. But part of our formation, I think, in seeking the shalom of our neighborhood as people who are socially located through this gospel message at a particular place in a particular time, part of our call is to look at our dollars and see how is it that we could also support the local business owner, the indigenous business owner who is struggling, but who has a vision, a hope, and a future, and a vocation given to them for the larger flourishing of our community. And my gospel, the way that I interpret the good news, is that is also that also belongs to the larger story. That also is integrated into my local decisions and how I've been shaped and how I've been formed. So, in a nutshell, in short, if our message, if our story doesn't speak to
a higher plane,
a multiplicity of issues in our lives, the multiple dimensions of our lives, right? The many roles that we play in life, just even looking at ourselves, then we might need to go out and get ourselves a bigger story.
Wow. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Jose Humphreys, pastor of Metro Hope, but also a consultant and facilitator. Here's a tough thing, and the reason why this is so powerful, and I like highlighting this from a faith context, is because I don't think I can find any other place that has the story to call us higher to that playing field. I think every other, if you go from a humanistic lens, you almost fall into either some form of segregationist type of ideology. I think because if you look at the reality, it is harder. It is getting harder, and that becomes more compelling. More and more.
That's right.
For some people in circles, and so even if they don't feel that it's that straight heart of a line, that it's like segregationist, racially and 100% like the old school way of thinking it, but economically segregationist, where we only work with our own people, we only deal with our own people, we start everything our own, and so we have this the walls be put up. And personally, to some degree, there's nothing wrong with that by itself, but more and more that's not the only that's not the only thing out there if we're shopping for a holistic long-term solution for these things, because I've even struggled with that too, and that's why the faith element here is so important, because it is a supernatural act to love your enemy. You have to lean on something bigger than yourself to even go through this journey and process of loving your neighbors, this, but here's my one thing to kind of bring it home. It sounds like if we're going to work this thing at a local level, the church becomes even more important, and that's another reason why I think this conversation has to be had more often. The church's role, with the churches on every block, and in so many churches in the country, across the country, they can be bases for this effort to occur, to give us the language and the tools to have these conversations and learn. But it sounds like we're going to have to go through a lot of learning ourselves in our own language, but also with dealing with that quote unquote white fragility. It sounds like we just have to go through that. And I feel like the movement has almost given up on that. And that's where the faith element comes in. It says, man, we got to love beyond that. If they don't get the terms or if they don't get the context, like for me, it's like a language has been a unnecessary barrier. Sometimes I think we get twisted too much on the words and the play on words and the academic understanding of words versus the layman term of words, and we miss each other on that stuff. But beyond that, it's hard to push through that in an empathetic way.
That's right. Yeah. I think, and we're talking inherently, I think, about discipleship. Some of the issues that you mentioned are, I think, at heart of discipleship issue. How churches are forming people, who are we sending out into the world? And if I were to say, if I were to tell you what a significant contribution for discipleship in our day would be, and I think, if I were to think about the different sorts of ingredients that need to go into the discipleship.
Perfect.
There are a couple of things, you know what I'm saying? And number one, a discipleship that accounts for disorientation. That you recognize that your disorientation doesn't just happen at that moment of repentance, right? Oh, woe unto me. I need to confess my sins. But we are consistently in moments of disorientation, right? The sediment is being shaken in a sense, and we don't allow ourselves to get inculcated into one way of thinking, but we're consistently allowing ourselves to be open and adaptable to new learning and new formation. And I think that really goes back to what Jesus talked about, right, with the introduction of the kingdom. It's a new wineskin, because if you try to pour new wine into it, an old wineskin, the old wineskin is going to burst. But we need both new wine to accommodate this new language, right, if you will, this new wineskin. And I think,
do you think that includes the church?
Absolutely. I think, I'm still pretty old school in that sense. I think that begins with the church. I think the church is a catalyst in that, in terms of we preach repentance every Sunday, right? We preach disorientation in some form or fashion every Sunday. At least we hope, unless, we're preaching another type of gospel, right? But if our gospel is truly gospel, it will allow for moments of inspiration, hope, transformation, and inherent within those things is disorientation. I need to change my mind about something, which is the root word for repentance, metanoia, right? I have a change of mind, a change of heart that is causing my life to now be reoriented in a different direction. So my choices are going to look different. The things I care about are going to look different, or the things that I was indifferent to now I really care about because God has touched my heart in such a way. So that's disorientation, and I think it's not until we allow that to be a part of the constitution, natural constitution of our discipleship, quote unquote, programming, then we're not going to create and form believers. We're not even going to allow ourselves those real growth moments. So we need disorientation. We need disruption. I think that what I just talked about now in terms of disorientation, personal level, right? Yeah. Now on a more macro level, I would say disruption. That we need to begin to name things when it comes to this issue of racism in a more direct way. What do I mean by that? Do I mean go out and call people racist? That's not what I'm getting at. You know that's not going to be as effective, especially in interpersonal relationships where we're not speaking truth to power, so to speak. But we need to we need to name things more directly. I've gone from I don't use the word reconciliation so much anymore, because when people, especially white Christians, often hear the word reconciliation, what we end up doing is having conversations, and it's you can just see this image. We're moving around furniture, but we're not having a gutting over, a makeover of what really needs to happen in terms of our relationships with one another. So people often hide behind the buzzwords like reconciliation as a way to be more inclusive, have more colorful jelly beans in the jelly bean jar, and to have dialogue. But it often stays on these very, very surface levels. And what I've begun to do, and I do this in the spirit of a pastoral voice that also needs to sometimes include that prophetic fire. I have colleagues who are just those prophets that they'll speak it and they'll name it and they'll disrupt it, and then they kick the dust off their sandals, and they'll just continue to go. But I'm the pastor that has to go back to that same pulpit on Sunday, right? And I have to walk along with people. But one of the things that I've been having conversations with a lot of my colleagues, both black and white and across the racial spectrum, is how we need to name the powers. We need to name white supremacy and whiteness for what it is, because it is a theological construct. It is a myth, a mythology. It doesn't exist. And yet we refer to the world, people in the world see the world through this overarching lens. So going back to the beginning of our conversation, where you have a preacher, i.e. John Macarthur, who's able to make these assertions about the civil rights movement, about race, about his experiences, while discounting the experience of thousands and millions of others, and not only here in the United States, but if you think about all over the globe, in a way that's so authoritative. It really speaks to the notion and the truth that he is not aware of his own whiteness. And in many ways, it is that deep. It is like the fish trying to name the water while in the fishbowl.
Now, can I press you on that real quick?
That's the kind of disorientation that I think, especially white Christians, need to begin to engage.
I just want to jump in real quick and just kind of lean in on that, because I find it's like, be aware of your own whiteness and your white privilege. It's almost like that is one issue, but I think just independent of that issue is just being made aware of the impacts of bias, regardless of whiteness, a white perspective, white privilege. It's almost like I find that going on the white privilege angle of like pointing out where he's wrong almost is a misdirection, where it's like, I'm sure that's there and that's happening too, but I think the heart beneath that, or maybe that is a symptom of just the lack of awareness, lack of knowledge, lack of facts of what's going on. Could it just be he's ignorant and it just so happens that he's white? Is that something separate, that it's white privilege? Because I look at white privilege. I kind of like when it's for some reason there's something in me that likes to separate those two things, to be intellectually fair when describing and naming things. Right? We talked about the importance of naming and language, all that stuff.
Well, this issue is a larger and more complex issue. But
we can punt it. We could punt it if you want. Well, let's just touch on it, and then we can continue it in another conversation about whiteness. There's the implicit bias piece that we began with and we talked about. Many people are implicitly biased, and
they're unawares. Now, the question is, where does that formation come from? What are the narratives that we have been shaped by and have been told historically since the inception of this country, since our own inception and our own introduction to the world, and all of the different mechanisms that have educated us and all the different mediums that have done that? So, yeah, I think to a certain extent, people might not be aware of the privilege and even their unconscious connection to whiteness. It was one of the things that Dr. King lamented toward the end of his day. He says, "I'm afraid that most white people in America are unconscious racists." So it was something that he had lamented because the civil rights movement, of course, was not very popular in many ways, like the Black Lives Matter movement today. Dr. King was a very controversial figure in his day, not very popular. Yeah. So when we look at the issue and the matter of whiteness, it in many ways, and this is not an understatement, it is the mediating lens, as one theologian said, by which we all interact with the world. We've all been affected and infected with it in one form or another. So me as a brown man, an Afro-Latino of Puerto Rican descent, has been influenced and affected by whiteness. James Baldwin, the prolific author and speaker, once said that we all have a little white guy inside of us. And what he was being facetious, but what he was really saying is that this is part of our formation as well, which is why
intuitively makes so much sense.
Yeah. You know, that's why I've been putting a premium on discipleship so much, because the discipleship that looks at itself, that looks within itself, and also its social location in the world, because these are the kinds of conversations that we need to have in order to dismantle those false ideologies, those mythologies that still inform us and create, by virtue of the fact, false identities. And part of the spiritual formation is to come back to our true identity in Christ as image bearers. I could go on for a lot longer with that, but I'll just leave that right there.
Well, I think for me too, because of where the average white person is, or even the average person in general, because, you know, a lot of our people are so disconnected from having these conversations in language too, that I don't think our people are armed. I think we're getting there, but we are armed to have these conversations too. So I don't want to just say like white people just don't get it and everyone else does, but I don't want to come across that way. But and I guess for me, it's like I like to name, because of where the average person is with these things, I like to name the ingredients and then name the cake. So right. To name the elements and then say all this together combined equals that. But I think that's just, we're naming the same thing. And with limited time,
it's a great place to start.
Yeah, in limited time we can only go so much. But one last thing too, you mentioned discipleship. You're using the word discipleship in a loose way. My passion and vision for the church has always been like, man, we gotta formalize discipleship in this element somehow, some way. Is there something in you that doesn't like it, thinking it that way, where it's like it has to be so organic that anytime we try to have like any type of intentionality, it might lose the magic? What say you, Jose, on how intentional we can be in this area of discipleship and racial equality and racial justice?
Sure. And thanks for clarifying that, because I'd also like to clarify my perspective on whether discipleship is an organic process versus something that's more systematic, that might include, let's say, curriculum or syllabus. I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and. I think we need content material, beginning with the gospel, beginning with our scriptures, and also some additional reads in there that could actually inform our perspectives as well. And I think we need regular times for meeting with people around discipleship.
Agreed, 100%.
I just tend to look at discipleship as interdisciplinary. In other words, in our formation, we have, of course, theological resources, but then we also have resources that might come from sociology and from science. Let's say we're doing a study on the book of Genesis, and we want to incorporate science into that. and we're not young creationists thinking that the earth is just 6,000 years old. How do the resources of science and God's revelation through science show us a more robust picture of what God intended when God created the earth, the moon, the stars, and God's creatures? So what I'm saying is that I think we need to rethink our discipleship, and we need materials, but we also need, in addition to materials, we need to become more cross-disciplinary. We also need to incorporate experiences. Yes. Let's take neighborhood walks. Let's have conversations in cafes. Let's interact with a piece of art, so that we're not giving primacy and supremacy to maybe the intellectual tradition, the more tradition that's based in reason, but we're also dealing with the whole person, a person that is moved by beauty, that God speaks through different means, through beauty, through creation, through science, even through logic models and organizational charts, that God also inspires us to think on those organizational granular levels as well, so as to create efficiencies.
Was that one for me?
That one was just for you.
You threw that. Yeah, you know who you're talking to, man. You know it.
I'm speaking your love language.
Yes,
that's what I mean. I think we need to go back to the drawing board when it comes to discipleship and make it a lot more robust, because if our gospel is that robust, if our gospel is that large and alternative, then it's going to require a framework, if you will, an approach to discipleship that's going to allow for the expression of that story to be embodied in the daily lives of Jesus followers.
Yeah. Wow, we could probably go on forever on this stuff. And just to kind of recap, man, we began with we talk about language and naming it. We just named the problems that we have found with John MacArthur's assessment on how the church should really, interact and be a compass for these issues of race, racism, identity, and all those things. We named that. I think we were very clear on how we felt about those things and how detrimental it can be to the efforts of living a full gospel if this is the ideology that's taking on in churches. We definitely spoke a lot about what the role of language and the importance of meeting people where they are, and discipleship and those mechanisms there, and how that we need Miami to expand on that. And I'm actually glad that you're working with Lisa on some stuff and materials on curriculum on that stuff. And that's, I'm looking forward to that. To close us out, anything you want to share with the audience when it comes to what you're doing, what you're about, where they can find you, because we talked about discipleship, we talked about race and racism in the church. Any resources that you want to point people to, books or content that you think people can pick up on before we have another conversation. I would love to have this as a kind of like an ongoing thing.
That'd be great. Podcast. I'd love to do it.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
I love that. Yeah, it's so important. So the floor is yours. Anything you want to close out with on what we covered and point people to?
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I love talking about this stuff, and I think it can be an ongoing conversation because there's so much.
Yeah, it's unpacked.
It entails.
Yeah,
that's right, and there's so much to unpack. I'd like to recommend one or two resources. My friend Daniel Hill, who's a pastor at River City Church in Chicago, has just written a book called White Awake, what it means to be white. And he's a white pastor who has, over the years, responded to that question, what it means to be white as a Christian, as a person in this country, and what have been the implications for him confronting that identity through his Christ identity. And I think it's a very approachable read. I would also like to recommend, and I recommend this all the time because I think to me it's where it all starts for Christians. When we talk about the good news, how we interpret the good news, Lisa Sharon Harper's very good gospel, how everything wrong can be made right. And I think she really gives a broader, more comprehensive brush, if you will,
Yeah.
over just many different dimensions of what the gospel is and how this story is much greater than the original story that we had received. So it's not that we received a false story, but we had received in many ways a limited story. And if it's good news, then the good news is that this gospel is actually impacting so much more than I had any idea about. And I'm currently working on a book as well, and specifically on discipleship and formation for living our lives in a way that not only speaks to this personal expression of the gospel, but what happens when the gospel meets justice and politics and race and all of those things, and how I've dealt with that at the local church level as a pastor. So that should be coming out in 2018. Awesome.
MetroHopeNYC.org, where you can catch, if you'd like to enjoyed and we're like really just moved and blessed by, I think I love having you on because of the way you frame things, and it's very powerful. If anyone listening enjoyed that, MetroHopeNYC.org is where you can go to kind of get the sermons if you're in the Harlem area. Susie and I always say this: if we're in Philly and we were in the area, we would be going to Metro Hope. It's a a great community to really explore these issues and more in a faith context, and it's a privilege to know you, Jose, and to to be able to tap into your mind and what God's showing you on these topics. Panvisio.org. We're going to have the podcast might be moved to joetlopez.com as we keep Panvisio as more of a marketing communications thing. So we just FYI, you might see that change. But overall, then the name of the podcast is the Q2 Podcast. If you've been blessed, if there's a pastor who's a little old school and might need something that disrupt their ideology a little bit, you might please consider sharing this episode, and but don't share it to our parents, though. My dad and his dad, we can't have them listen to this episode. We'll be disowned. Just kidding.
Excommunicated.
So thanks so much, Jose. Tell the family and everyone there at Metro I said hi, and we'll be talking soon.
Hey, Joey, thank you so much. Thanks for having me. My love to you and yours, and I'm hoping that we can do this again soon, brother.
Definitely. Be well. God bless. See ya.
All right. Peace, brother. Take care.